RNCM, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the last research seminar of this quite extraordinary term. So welcome, everybody. It's great to see you here, both within the Zoom session and the ones who are joining us on the YouTube live stream. I'm Annika Folkert. I'm the new lecturer in music at the RNCM here, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Sarah Collins this afternoon. Sarah is an associate professor of music and the chair of musicology at the University of Western Australia. So the first thing to say is that we're extremely lucky to have her here with us, because for her, of course, it's not a civilized time to be giving a research paper at all, or in fact to be doing any talking. So it's a great honor and a great pleasure to have you here, Sarah. But it's also a great pleasure and an honor because Sarah is one of these researchers with an incredibly impressive and wide-ranging research profile. And in fact, it's so impressive that I really only want to mention some of her most recent and big publications from last year, 2019. Her monograph, Lateness and Modernism, Untimely Ideas About Music, Literature and Politics in Interwar Britain, which came out with CUP in 2019. And in the same year and same publisher, CUP, and the edited collection Music and Victorian Liberalism, Composing the Liberal Subject. The same year, 2019, Sarah was also awarded the Macready Musicological Award by the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and she's editing the Oxford Handbook of Music and Intellectual Culture in the 19th Century. Sarah, your research encompasses music aesthetics within broader political and intellectual movements, and both Barbara Kelly and I here at the RNCM overlap with this, be it shared interest in the International Society for Contemporary Music, for example, and its history and politics, or be it the early 20th century British scene more broadly, really. And you wrote to say that you've also got an exciting grant coming up, which you're going to be working on for the next 3 years with 3 co-investigators on an ARC, so Australian Research Council Discovery Project, which is called The Cultural and Intellectual History of Automated Labour, which looks at intersections between notions of art and work from the Industrial Revolution to today, and including a discourse around musical automation. And I think we'll get a glimpse of some of these ideas that are manifesting themselves around this really, really fascinating topic today, this afternoon in your talk, which is called Animating the Inanimate, Musical Mechanization in Interwar Broadcasting, Film and Opera. Sarah.
Thanks so much, Annika. You can hear me okay? Is that coming through okay? Yep, awesome. Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, and thanks also to Barbara Kelly for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here and to join this final session. So thank you. I'll get straight into it. So it's an odd thing about the scholarly cycle that sometimes projects that originated at quite different times and for quite different purposes all of a sudden coalesce around a similar publication deadline. And as you find yourself working on these disparate projects at the same time, certain links between them sometimes start to emerge, links that you would perhaps not have discerned were it not for this simultaneity. Over the course of the COVID-19 haze of this year, I realised that a number of the projects that I've been working on all involve some kind of inanimate object that becomes animated by sound. These inanimate objects might include machines or mechanical apparatus of various kinds, such as the gramophone or the radio or a music box or a pianola or a music automaton. And there has, of course, been a great deal of scholarship from media and sound studies perspectives on these types of devices in recent years. Some other inanimate objects animated by sound that have cropped up in my recent projects include marionettes, puppets, dolls, and ventriloquist dummies, things that have also been the subject of a great deal of scholarship in modernism studies and elsewhere in recent years. And yet another category of objects of interest are stones, be they geological formations that are depicted in literature, art, and opera as coming alive with music, or stone statues, monuments, or tombs that are made to speak or sing, the stone guest in Mozart's Don Giovanni being an obvious example. In instances where these types of object become animated by sound, the sound is presented as coming from the object, but it is also clearly external to it, setting up a tension between the sense that the object is being given voice and asserting itself through sound, on the one hand, and at the same time the sense that it is being controlled by sound that issues from elsewhere. With this tension in mind, a final category that could be added to this collection of inanimate things might be human bodies that sing or speak. For example, it is often claimed that opera has always been mechanical in some sense. Operatic voices seem to exceed the confines of the bodies that produce them, appearing to be directed by an external source outside of the body. In constructivist terms, the uncanny nature of the operatic voice serves as a simulacrum for the problem of human agency, performing the split between what is said and the source of the saying that highlights the operation variously of either the subconscious or of social conditioning or governmentality or biopolitics, depending on your perspective, so things that condition our behaviour outside of ourselves. In psychoanalytic terms, opera's uncanniness emblemizes the alienation of the subject in language and the difficulty of achieving an unmediated sense of ourselves. There is simultaneous terror and thrill conveyed by the double meanings created by operatic bodies. They appear as automata that are animated by unseen musical forces, in a similar manner perhaps to the mismatch between the voice and its source in the case of the gramophone, which, as Hans Gumbrecht described, inspires, quote, both the fear of ghosts and the hope for eternal life, unquote. So it's no surprise then that metaphors of mechanization abound in opera and opera criticism, as well as the actual incorporation of or thematization of mechanical devices such as puppets, music boxes, and other mechanisms. So what can we draw from this disparate collection of objects animated by sound? Machines, marionettes, stones, and bodies. Wait, let me try and move my... Oh, there we go. When they appear throughout early 20th century art, we are accustomed to thinking of them as being bound up with some kind of confrontation with the conditions of, for example, modern factory assembly line, labour, automated labour, mass warfare, or capitalist consumerism. They also are thought to reflect an increasing awareness of the operation of inner human drives that are outside of our rational control, an idea made popular, of course, through the writings and practice of Freud and others. This is an idea of the uncanny machine within. These themes can be readily found in discussions of so-called mechanised music in the interwar period in Britain. The term mechanised music was used in the 1920s and 30s in the British music press to refer to music that is delivered at a distance from the source of its sound, such as over radio or gramophone. The term was often, but not always, used in the pejorative. For example, in 1931, Dorothy Swainson wrote an article in Music and Letters in which she worried that music that is heard over loudspeakers, radio, gramophone, or other types of mechanical reproduction, and this is a term that she used, mechanical reproduction, would be increasingly accepted by listeners as being, quote, identical to real music. So she wrote, not long ago, Mr. West, in the first of his 3 canto lectures delivered before the Society of Arts, said that the gramophone company was at present expecting, by means of some newly discovered process, to produce such perfect records that even the most hardened critic would be unable to tell the difference between the reproduction and the original. Yet there is a difference, and the difference is not only vital, but permanent. So Swainson's argument was clearly aimed against changing patterns of cultural consumption. Yet she cast her argument in physiological terms. There was an actual physical difference, she wrote, between sounds produced by means of electrical oscillations and the vibrations of real music, namely music made by vibrating strings or pipes, in her account, with the effect of the gramophone and like devices being to trick the listener into accepting this cold and unmoving imitation as being akin to the authentic, sensuous experience. So she used these terms, cold, unmoving, as against sensuous. Swainson likened this experience to looking at postcards of a friend's vacation, as opposed to really being there. No matter how loud the sound, she thought, it would always lack a vibrant intensity that live music possessed. A decade on, it was abundantly clear that so-called mechanised music was here to stay. So Eric Blom gave advice on how to counteract mechanisation. Rather than opposing the, quote, tired of mechanised music sweeping in an irresistible current of wireless and gramophone, he believed that one must cultivate a variety of musical tastes by working on one virtue alone. He writes, that virtue is personal exertion of some kind or another. Do things yourself, make your own music. That is the secret. Make your home musical, not by twisting knobs or adjusting needles, which is only to supply the house with a new commodity. but by playing and singing. If that is not to be done, then by the makeshift of strumming and squawking. If you cannot do your best, do your worst. You can keep it to yourself after all, and thus, even with your puniest efforts, assert your superiority over the gramophone and the wireless, whose peculiar debility is that they depend entirely on the goodwill of others and are absolutely nothing in themselves. There are once again several familiar themes that appear here. A concern about a move towards consumption over production or participation, the idea of the importance of participating in musical performance as a form of self-assertion, linked with the older idea from Victorian cultural philanthropy that in labour we do not only create objects, but we create ourselves through the process of labour. We also see here a latent view that the media that relays a message affects the message relayed, namely that there is a loss of fidelity of some kind, communicative fidelity, a loss of immediate bodily experience when sound is separated from its physical source. These types of themes were not only the preoccupation of self-selected cultural gatekeepers like Swainson and Blom. We also see them in popular culture and across the Atlantic. For example, for the sake of the end of the day, I'm going to play here a Betty Boop animation from 1932 that reveals the implications of that revels in the implications of mediated communication in relation to both writing, voice, and sound. So watch for the moment when her lips become detached and when her father's angry admonishments are made to lose their force when his wife changes his wax cylinder. And later in the clip, the meaning of a farewell letter that Betty Boop writes to her parents is changed to a welcome back letter when the note is cut up, evincing a third type of dismemberment and replacement that speaks to the mischievous effects of media in mixing up the message to reveal some kind of truth or reality that the characters actually have failed to see themselves. So I'll just play a little bit from that clip. Let me see whether it works. 120.
Ich zu Hudson, Papa. Hey?
Don't you sob, rotten Betty.
And when I must once more tell you to eat, then I will right away send you out from the house out. That's all. You hear? I won't have it. I won't have it. You go to school in the morning and you stay there all day. You make hard and you study hard. And you come home and you won't get it.
Oh, come on, Betty.
I say, what's this? What's this news? I won't have it. I won't have it. Why did you say something? Why did you say something? And when your father is out, what's this? What's it loose? What's this? Don't talk to me! Don't talk to me! Do not touch it! I won't have it! I won't have it!
What's the matter? They always pick on me. They never let me be. I'm so very lonely, awfully sad. In the long time since you've been glad, but I know.
Okay, let me just play a little bit from the end too. So she comes racing back home. Okay, so we also see this in this clip, in this next clip from Felix the Cat in 1930s, so it's all early 30s, where he uses a wheel of Swiss cheese as a piano roll to bring a two-dimensional image of a player piano to life. Oh, sorry. One thing. So these types of preoccupation with the relationship between mechanized objects, the gramophone head, the billboard pianola, that become animated by sound are often paired with what David Bolter and Richard Gruson have called hypermediacy, an explicit foregrounding within an artwork of the medium of the artwork itself. Felix the cat is presented as being cognizant that he is a fictional figure in the way he is able to modify his environment beyond the bounds of physical possibility or even narrative logic. Betty Boop, in other clips from the 1930s, is depicted as hopping off the page and speaking with her animator and jumping in the ink next to his hand, etc. These gestures of hypermediacy serve to make the audience cognizant that they are watching an artful construction. The reason these cartoons are so interesting is that the characters are continuously using the mechanical nature of their construction to their own purposes, flipping in and out of the diegesis, like a kind of lucid dreaming. Carolyn Abate has noticed this feature of early sound film as well, where moving objects that have a sound attached to them are in fact depicted as being moved by the sound rather than causing the sounds themselves. And this device of making the audience cognizant of the media will become important when we talk later on about Busoni's devices of estrangement in his opera Dr. Faust, and their relationship with Brecht and Weil's devices developed for political purposes in epic theatre. Indeed, Weil's notion of musical justice was described as a manner of animating the actors, of driving their movements as part of a deliberate strategy of estrangement, of making the audience continuously aware that they are watching a construction rather than being immersed by affect. This is also a form of hypermediacy, I would argue, in contrast to the immediacy of a work that conceals its media, like realist photography, which offers its image up as if it's being a direct reproduction of reality. If we think only of the incorporation of machines into modernist art, then there are a variety of readings that suggest themselves, and I've got them there. First, that these objects reflect concerns about the machine-like nature of man, our lack of control, our lack of individual volition, so Freud's notion of the uncanny, the automaton inside us all, that we are determined, we're just sort of part of an unfolding clockwork, that they reflect concerns. So the second one, I'll just get rid of that, sorry. The second one there being that they reflect concerns about machinic replacement of man, not only in the automation of labour, but also more broadly the replacement of individuals by systems, by bureaucratic systems, resulting in the standardisation of tastes, as well as the very real labour implications for musicians when live performance is replaced by mechanical imitations, and in the process losing the self-transforming or self-asserting aspects of labour. This critique is bound up with market capitalism and modern alienation, the idea that we are controlled or we become controlled by the things that we produce and consume. And the third reading there is the idea that these interactions reflect a valorization of the real, the authentic, the original over the imitation, a sort of legacy of romanticism that reflects a sort of a type of search for the self, a self that could be recovered through musical labour and non-mediated direct experience. So it's a thirst for direct experience, and as a counteracting of the alienation of the subject in language and in changed relations of production in capitalist markets. My purpose for the remainder of the talk will be to firstly explore how new media in the interwar period allegorise these concerns or conditions, but I would also like to suggest that hypermediacy in new media was not merely a reflection of these concerns, but rather about countering them with an alternative vision, a vision that at first blush looks nihilistic in that it acknowledged that there is no original source, no core essence of the self, no possibility of immediate experience lost, but rather than nihilism, this vision is melancholic, as we shall see, but it's also related to a notion of freedom that is premised on self-consciousness or self-awareness. The idea here is that self-awareness makes us spectators on our own lives because we're unable to experience things firsthand, but at the same time, this sense of spectatorship rescues us from a deterministic unfolding of life. It saves us from becoming automata, simply playing out our role. This alternative vision will become clearer, I hope, as we discuss particular examples. So I'll be exploring these ideas by linking, somewhat opportunistically, two projects that I've been recently finalising. One looks at interwar public broadcasting in the form of the BBC, in relation to which we'll see concerns about mechanisation of music and listeners taken up by the medium itself, as well as in the architectural and organisational structure of the BBC and Broadcasting House in the early 1930s. The other example relates to a particular interwar opera, Ferruccio Busoni's Dr. Faust, whose puppet play aesthetic and devices that separate voice from body links with Brecht and Weil's theatrical experiments of estrangement, as I've mentioned. The coming together of the tragic figure of Faust with the medium of opera and the devices of estrangement that help us think about the melancholic character of freedom offered by a disposition of spectatorship. So this will sort of clarify things at the end, I think. In these examples, I hope to show that some of the ideas that have been bound up with new media and technology in the interwar period around mechanised music have a far longer history that can be seen in cases where inanimate objects become animated by sound. In particular, I wonder, what if we don't view the preoccupations with puppets and machines and automata in early 20th century art as being wholly related to technology, warfare, or consumerism, but part of new media's embrace of a more long-standing aesthetic of hypermediacy? So that's kind of the thought experiment of this exercise. So this first case study comes from a project that looked at the rhetorical construction of the middle brow by critics of certain shifting patterns of cultural consumption in 1930s Britain. While there were various positions represented in this field of criticism, it's enough for our purposes to note that there was often a conflation of the mechanical nature of sound technology and the mechanical type of behaviour and thinking that this technology was thought to produce. Mechanised music was thought to literally produce mechanised minds. This conflation crystallised around criticisms of the BBC during this period. Such was the symbolic strength of the BBC as a target for attacks on the middle brow that Hugh Ross Williamson, editor of the Bookman, writing in 1932, could describe World War I as important only as an arbitrary dividing line because it happened to coincide with two things of enormous importance in moulding the changing life of the nation: the rapid expansion of the popular press and the introduction of broadcasting. The author called these two things new weapons far more deadly than any used in warfare, and referred to the presenters on BBC Radio as having been, quote, selected by an autocratic regime, end quote. Fittingly, perhaps, the article is accompanied by an ominous-looking image of the BBC headquarters broadcasting house at Langham Place, which in this production has the unmistakable bearing of one of the buildings in Fritz Lang's film Metropolis from 1927, with the wide factory-like entry and rectangular stone windows. Indeed, the BBC Director General in 2003, who oversaw the redevelopment of the site, Greg Dyke, described this building as frightening, and the architect who redesigned it described the original studio spaces as looking spooky, like a German expressionist film set. This image, coupled with the suggestion that the BBC was a weapon more powerful than warfare, seems to invite us to imagine the troops of uniformly dressed BBC employees marching in step into and out of this building at the call of a master's whistle. And indeed, this mechanistic imagery was not only a description of the standardising effects of public broadcasting, which F.R. Leavis called the levelling down, but it was also thought to be expressed through the material building blocks and institutional practices of the BBC itself during this period, specifically at Broadcasting House. Whistleblower Richard Lambert, founding editor of the BBC's The Listener magazine, in his book Ariel and All Its Quality from 1940, painted a bleak image of oppressive employee conditions and dictatorial management practices at the BBC that were supposedly aimed against staff cultivating any sense of individualism or even any level of personal privacy. An account that led to an parliamentary inquiry and a redesign of personnel policies at the organisation. This focus on centralised control at an institutional level may in part have been prompted by the early conception of wireless technology as a tool of military and governmental power in the context of weakening imperial control and global tensions. This conception was actively promoted within the Marconi Company's magazines and marketing activities. Ironically for Marconi, who pitched the technology as a user-pays communication service rather than anything like the free public broadcasting service that it became in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. This way of presenting the potential use of the technology only highlighted the importance of maintaining state control over communication infrastructure along the lines of other utilities such as transport, food, and health, which had come under central state administration during the war. Whereas before the war, most liberals viewed the role of government as being to maintain a system within which individuals could freely compete, after the war this shifted towards state-managed forms of social welfare and protection, representing a fundamental change in the conception of government that was a cause of concern for some. As such, tropes of mechanisation and centralisation that were already being deployed to voice concerns about ongoing government overreach after the war came to be applied to the BBC and its associated technologies. Constant Lambert described the BBC presenter Christopher Stone as a benevolent autocrat who, quote, enjoys a position of dictatorship as fantastic as anything in Huxley's Brave New World, end quote. That was a text also published in 1932. And he applied mechanistic imagery to phenomena that he viewed as synonymous with this ethos of cultural democratisation. For example, in Lambert's discussion of Hindemith in Music Ho, Hindemith as a craftsman, the composer's utilitarian anti-aesthetic attitude was likened to gymnastic technique, like, quote, troops of healthy uniformed children on their way to a communal gymnasium, end quote. Another critic who contributed to the negative construction of the musical middlebrow, Cecil Gray, described Hindemith in the same way only a few years later, writing that his ferro-concrete architecturalism is in all essentials the music counterpart to the visions of the future life on Earth imagined and portrayed by H.G. Wells in his prophetic romances and by Huxley in his satire, Brave New World. So we see here a link being forged between aesthetics of accessibility and authoritarianism, which reinforced these ominous depictions of the BBC. The BBC was moved into the purpose-built broadcasting house in the same year of 1932. And in an issue of the Architectural Review published that was dedicated to responding to the opening of the building, some commentators emphasised the way in which the temple-like permanence of the stone structure served to anchor the ephemeral medium that projected from within. So it's a medium in the air, so it needed stone, something really permanent to counter that, to anchor that. The nature of public broadcasting meant that the audio produced was intended to reach out to the entire British Empire, collapsing spatial distance, while the mode of production was of course centralised and located. A program of regional services had been cut during World War I to create a centralised home service with uniform programming across Britain. The building achieves this sense of being both everywhere, decontextualised, deterritorialised, and somewhere, located and embedded. By a contrast in its external and internal design, the outer evoking the permanence of a public monument and the interior being largely cut off from the world around it through light and climate control and artificial ventilation, the first building in London to achieve this, in order to serve the demands of media production. The practicality of broadcast at that time required a system of centralised organisation. The dramatic control panel, pictured here, enabled a single producer to curate a radio play using sound produced live in 11 separate studios within the building. Drawing from Jonathan Stern's notion that recorded sound is by its nature deterritorialised, yet at the same time reliant on location, namely the studio, Stefan Eriksson has noted how, in such studios, people performed for the machines, not for audiences. The machines were built to reproduce sounds, not eavesdrop on existing original ones. Thus, the building itself was a representative and constitutive medium of public broadcasting as much as the media that was broadcast from within its walls. For Eriksson, all of the factors just mentioned about Broadcasting House, the relationship between the exterior and the interior, the centralised and interlinked organisation of its studios, and the climactic control that effectively cut it off from the world around it, decontextualised it, meant that the building itself acted as a giant tympanic membrane, transducing signals in one mode to signals in another, like the human ear, and also like early sound reproduction technology. Likewise, for our critics of the 1930s who implicated the BBC in the encouragement of a consumerist rather than participatory attitude towards music culture, both the institution and its infrastructure evokes the ethos of assembly line mass production and the centralised authority that oversees it. So we see here now the notion of a stone building projecting sound, or an inanimate radio being animated by sound, is made to allegorize a lack of vitality that is bound up with the absence of any original or immediate experience. The musicians performed for machines, not for audiences. There was no original. Broadcast music was a copy of a copy in this sense, rather than a documentation of an original event. The final example of how the animation of inanimate objects through sound may have served as an allegory of the thwarted promise of direct experience comes in the form of Busoni's opera Dr. Faust, which he left incomplete at his death in 1924. But first, a short note on how the medium of opera forms part of the prehistory to the types of animation of the inanimate that concern us here, predating the technological new media to which tropes of mechanization are most readily applied. It has been suggested, for example, that opera is itself a form of reckoning with the status of bodies in the world, emblemized through music's uneasy role within the operatic medium. In 2001, for example, Carolyn Abate, you knew I was going to mention Abate, uses a reading of Mozart's The Magic Flute, among other examples, to support an argument about the way in which the operatic medium holds together both the flighty, ungraspable aspects of musical expression in combination with the very present material mechanics of performance, so flightiness and the material stableness. Again, we have these kind of dualisms. For Abate, there are several things that align the bodily performance event element of opera with death. First, there is the uncanny hand in the puppet effect of a singer conceptualized as an inert vehicle or automata at the direction of the composer. Second is opera's predilection for including dismembered body parts or inanimate objects that are given voice or musical sound by unseen mechanisms and that engender an effect on the living. And third, the mortality of a live performance that once finished cannot be relived. Even passionate recounts of operatic performances and narrative uses of operatic experience in literature contribute to opera's architecture of its metropolis, according to Abate. Abate is concerned here with authority and voice in opera, and the ways in which it is created and subverted through uncanny moments of presence, like the singer's bodily presence, the composer's omnipresence, and the visceral presence of the voice, as well as moments of absence. She seeks out a type of liveness that cannot be attributed to either composer's inscription or the performer's rendering of it, and regards these moments of presence as music that is not heard, as a metaphor for the ungraspable and the fleeting. According to Abate, these moments are to be found in certain operas that thematize or embody a doomed desire to capture the fleeting nature of performance, such as when a character attempts to deprive a living thing of life in order to possess it. She undertakes a reading of Mozart's The Magic Flute, which is an important opera for Busoni, in this vein, highlighting how moments of light and life in the opera serve in fact as simulacra for automation and mortuary, while moments of darkness and death become harbingers of freedom. For example, the bells that are gifted to Papageno to protect him from evil forces are musically animated in a way that in fact silences his voice, overriding it with the sound akin to mechanized laughter. Abate suggests that the flighty nature of music as a medium, whose character is encapsulated by the metamorphic queen, appears more human, more alive than Papageno's mechanistic objectification of his bird nature. The opera holds these deathly and living things in conflict, with the music serving as a progenitor of lingering doubt, refusing to allow singular meanings to settle. The spectre of dismembered body parts that become reanimated is a key theme for Abate, with the singing head of Orpheus, another object animated by sound, serving as the master symbol of her argument. The idea of a mechanistic Papageno, joyous in his natural state and absent of self-consciousness, yet without freedom or doubt or reason as a result, calls to mind the very type of unthinking enthrallment that Busoni was using the puppet aesthetic and other devices of estrangement to strengthen, rather than hide the artificial nature of opera. A number of contemporary productions of Busoni's Dr. Faust pay tribute to this aspect of Busoni's opera, a production that ran from September through November 2006 at Zurich Opera House with Thomas Hampson as Faust did include, where is it? Yep, Commedia-inspired costumes and a masked on-stage chorus exhibiting highly stylized gestural techniques. And in a production that was staged at the Munich Opera Festival in 2008, the spirits were forewarned by nude statue-like bodies painted in gold and hanging from above the stage by their ankles. In both these contemporary productions, the 6 spirits that are magically roused by Faust in the second prologue were represented by dismembered or decontextualized body parts that are animated by offstage voices. The Zurich production included spirits represented, as you can see there, by a classical bust, a totem stack of 3 helmets, an object made up of 3 mannequin legs attached together at the buttocks, punctured with pinpoints of light, and one of 3 red rams' heads with glowing eyes. The final representing Mephistopheles before he appears in human form. There is evidence to suggest that Busoni likely knew of Edward Gordon Craig's polemical article in The Mask, where he toyed with the notion of replacing human actors with life-size marionettes. And Busoni was certainly invested in the work of Heinrich von Kleist and E.T.A. Hoffmann, for whom marionettes and automata were distinctive themes. Yet far from valorising automata and seeking after a bodiless art in the manner of Craig and others, Busoni sought to emphasise the latent tension in performance between the instrumentalisation of bodies and their ability to assert themselves, forging a link between opera and epic theatre, I would argue. His Dr. Faust includes a range of devices for estrangement that I would argue present an allegory of an uneasy relationship between the body, voice and language, and these devices include these type of things, which I won't go through each one, I'll just read them and focus on one after. So one is the use of the Pappenspiel aesthetic, also the deployment of Schlagwort or textual abridgment, the use of an offstage chorus and theorization of something he called acoustic perspective, the discontinuous format of the opera that draws attention to discrete situations rather than long-term causes and consequences, Busoni's emphasis on creating a sense of spectatorship and pretense through the magical theme of the opera, the framing device of a poet speaking directly to the audience before the bookends the performance of the opera. The representation of Faust as a spectator on his own unfolding fate, and the role of the offstage chorus as dispassionate observer or untragic hero, that in the way that Walter Benjamin described in his essay about epic theatre. And Busoni's de-emphasis on empathy or sensation attached to the subject matter, and the way in which Dr. Faust is self-consciously positioned as an encapsulation of Busoni's theory of opera. So it's a self-conscious working out of something he described elsewhere. Busoni's Schlagwort became influential for Brecht and Weil's respective conceptualization of gestus in epic theatre, and indeed served a similar function to that later attributed to Brecht's estrangement effect, namely the strategy whereby the actor makes the audience cognizant of the fact that they are watching an artificial construction by acknowledging the gaze of the audience. They do this through gests or stylized behaviours designed to reveal the socially constructed nature of human interaction, encapsulating Brecht's rejection of the bourgeois notion of split subjectivity. Busoni was committed to communicating the manifest pretense of opera. As his biographer Edward Dent described, Busoni, quote, had no wish to deny or disguise the artificiality of opera, end quote, which is why he tended towards forms that reference the magical, the supernatural, and the artificial, including marionettes and puppets. So Busoni wrote that the sung word will always remain a convention on the stage and a hindrance to any semblance of truth. To overcome this deadlock with any success, a plot would have to be made in which singers act what is incredible, fictitious, and improbable from the very start, so that one impossibility supports the other and both become possible and acceptable. Opera should take possession of the supernatural or unnatural as its only proper sphere of representation and feeling, and should create a pretense world in such a way that life is reflected in either a magic or a comic mirror, presenting consciously that which is not to be found in real life. Busoni's Faust desires to be both puppet and puppet master. In his pact with Mephistopheles, Faust desires all-knowing comprehension, all the experience of the world, but also to be aware of these experiences, to live these experiences at a distance, unlike Don Juan, who in David Wellebury notes, lives imminently in the present, with his conquests being recalled for him in retrospect by a third party. Busoni draws from the Goethean tradition of conceiving Faust as not at home in the world, by making unnecessary reference to a range of national affiliations. Yet Faust is also not at home in the world because he lives as a spectator on his own life, despite his desire for first-hand, unself-conscious experience. This search is what Wellebury attributes to the condition of art, the pastness of art, unable to be experienced in the present, its ghostly and ungraspable quality, the echo-like quality that we've discussed previously. Art emblemizes the impossibility of direct experience. Slavoj Žižek's reading of Busoni's Dr. Faust shares with Abate's reading of Mozart's The Magic Flute the view that it is music that shows how freedom is undergirded by mechanization. For Žižek, Busoni's Faust is a Papageno-like figure who succumbs mechanistically to his drives for wine and food and women, pursuing an inevitable unfolding of natural events. The puppet is as a human who does not labour under self-awareness. He is always desiring, but his desires are never satiated because they are directed at a mere placeholder for something else. So there's Lacanian inflections in that reading, of course. This compulsive desiring, what Freud described as the death drive, is for Žižek like the blind force of the faceless broomstick character in Walt Disney's A Sorcerer's Apprentice, who keeps on filling the water reservoir even though it is already filled, even to the point of walking tendaciously through the uprising water in order to continue his task. The puppet, or marionette, in Žižek's rendering is undead, not living, but not living either. As a result of it being driven by a single hand outside of itself, the marionette has a grace and weightlessness of one guided by an impersonal passion, but without life and freedom and spontaneity and substance, is completely determined, which, as Žižek points out, is akin to Kant's description of the hypothetical condition of man if he were to have access to the elusive thing in itself. Instead of the conflict which now the moral disposition has to wage with inclinations, and in which, after some defeats, moral strength of mind may be gradually won, God and eternity in their awful majesty would stand unceasingly before our eyes. The conduct of man, so long as his nature remained as it is now, would be changed into mere mechanism, whereas in a puppet show, everything would gesticulate well, but no life would be found in the figures. The puppet offers the spectre of a world where there is no need for a sense of moral duty, moral conflict or decision, melancholy or hope, because conduct in this world would conform with the inevitable law of natural things, a mechanistic unfolding. The hypothetical man who gains access to the nominal realm is living but without life, experiencing but without substance. Žižek likens this state to a puppet, and the puppet appears to have a weightlessness and overabundance of life because its life is not contextualized through the usual indices of meaning ascribed to a human body or attached to human gestures. The reading of the mechanistic necessity of a marionette is conceived by Žižek via Lacan as a monstrous thing. This is my final quote. Žižek describes it as a weird organ which is magically automatized, surviving without a body whose organ it should have been, in an indivisible, indestructible, and immortal. More precisely, undead in the sense this term has in horror fiction, not the sublime spiritual immortality, but the obscene immortality of the living dead, who, after every annihilation, recompose themselves and clumsily go on. It does not exist, it insists, an entity of pure semblance, a multiplicity of appearances like imitations, copies of copies, which seem to envelop a central void. So there's no original, the void in the center. Its status is purely phantasmic. I'm drawing to a close. Don't worry. What saves Faust from lapsing into this mechanistic figure is also the source of his downfall, namely his drive to experience all there is to experience, acting as a spectator on the totality of human life, rather than someone bound up in immanent experience like Mozart's Don Giovanni. In other words, it is Faust's self-consciousness that makes him different from the puppet-like natural man Papageno, and indeed Faust disregards the offers of the five spirits on the basis that they are the first five spirits, on the basis that they are limited to the capacities of nature nature, accepting instead the offer of the sixth spirit, Mephistopheles, who offers him the swiftness of human thought. Zizek sees this conflict between Faust's desire to be unself-conscious and therefore mechanistic, and his distant stance as being held in balance by the absence of music at the end of the score, referring to Busoni's inability to complete the opera before his death. For our purposes, the point to be highlighted here is the notion that dismembered parts that are reanimated do not merely suggest the monstrous, undead, or mechanized, but also they call to attention the way in which inanimate things that become animate can resist wholeness or foreclosure. They are not merely artificial life, life without life, melancholy parts waiting for the unattainable whole, but rather they revel in their artificial animation, and they promise no authentic or original event underlying them. In this way, these objects manage to resist the cult of the authentic that was the legacy of Romanticism, but they, at the same time, they manage to resist becoming entirely deterministic, entirely automated. They present an alternative vision of thwarted direct experience, an idea that predated new media, but which substantially shaped its aesthetics of hypermediacy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. This is amazingly rich. Yeah, and I think we're all probably blown out of our socks because there was just such richness of
Too much.
no, there can never be too much of that. No, it's brilliant. Thank you so much. I've written down lots of things and I have lots of questions that I want to ask you. But I've just had a slightly animated discussion with Barbara in the chat over who gets to ask that question first. And we've been saying, no, you go first. No, you go first. Barbara, mine isn't quite formulated yet. So I want to thank Sarah once more and then think about everything while you can maybe ask your question.
Excellent.
Thank you, Annika. Thanks so much, Sarah. And I apologise for having to go to academic board and creep into this and miss the start of your talk. So I'm sorry about that. I'd love to have heard the beginning bit, so my questions might seem quite naive, but there are so many parallels with some of the issues I work on France, and particularly around the sort of whole mechanization issue, the sort of switching off human and the blurring, I guess, of human and machine. So you talk a lot about puppets and marionette and a lot of that, and I wondered, I didn't know very much about Busoni's Dr. Faust. Now I had a quick look to see, but it really coincides with a fascination in France, and I'm thinking of something such as Honegger's Le Dit du Jeu du Monde, and also Millot's L'Homme et son désir, and also the La Création du Monde, where the masks are human and completely hamper any movement, so that they cover the human and almost obliterate the human. And of course, Raval had always had a real sort of fascination of switching human and mechanical. Think of L'Heure Espagnole, but there's so many other examples of that. So I wonder whether this is just I've got ideas about the fascination with some of these things in that period, 1916, and into the interwar period. But I wondered where you thought Busoni's interest, where that came from, and whether there might be some connections with France.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think, one of the things I said towards the beginning was about the temptations of reading these things in the ways they have been read and are undoubtedly true, like the idea of it dealing with, the machine within the human, and the mechanistic nature of humans, but also human replacement by machines, and that these sort of readings, and also like a longing for the real, a longing for the immediate, some kind of pre-dawn innocence. So I wanted to offer something different from those, but I would hope that this kind of idea of melancholy, the idea of sort of offering up an awareness of a lack of a center, like the void at the center, but not in a fatalistic way like the futurist presented technologies, or not sort of in a heavily ironic way, thinking of Sati and the like. I think it's so tempting because you can collect these things together in a big file of every single example between 1918 and 1930 that has machines depicted in certain ways, and that would be an interesting project. But I just wanted to explore just an unusual link that sort of had popped up. But yeah, in terms of sort of concrete links with France, there would probably be people here who'd be able to talk more closely to that. I mean, obviously, Berlin was Busoni was an international figure. His link with Dent was my tenuous link to Britain and the BBC context. But in reality, I mean, he had very close links with British musical modernists of the kind of stripe that I'm dealing with. Obviously lived a lot of his life in Berlin, obviously identified as German and Italian, and lived in Boston for a few years and in Switzerland for a few years. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if he had a very broad reading and very broad exposure. The one thing I'm really interested in is his link with Edward Gordon Craig, because they knew so many similar people: Delius, Isadora Duncan. There are a list of about 4 or 5 people that they had in common that they knew, but there's no direct meeting between them. There's no evidence of direct meeting between them. If anyone has found evidence of that, I'd love to hear from them. The reason I raise it is because Craig's work was so important in France as well as in Britain. The idea of sort of modernist theatre and his European kind of reputation was so prominent. I find it so hard to believe that these two people didn't meet, given their interest in puppets and replacement of bodies. And it doesn't answer your question, but yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I forgot to say, obviously, Tom reminded me before that as we're streaming on YouTube, obviously we can field questions from this Zoom room, as it were. But if people are watching us on YouTube and have questions they want to ask, you can email to research@rncm.ac.uk, and Tom will keep an eye on that. And I'll keep an eye on the chat here in the Zoom meeting, and we'll try to not overburden Sarah with questions, but just find out what more connections we can field and we can come up with. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Are there any other questions before I just take the floor and get carried away? Raise your hand.
I don't mind lingering. If anybody's unconvinced, or I mean, I can apologize for a lack of clarity, but there are some, when I'm so used to locating things so closely in one national context or one very concrete interaction between actual people in an actual venue, and then you can look at sort of broader ideas around that and how they interact. But I'm aware that when you start to muse across different projects, that there are certain local things that become, that you have to smooth over. And so if anybody is crinkling their brow going, that doesn't sound right, then I'd be very happy to hear that kind of question or criticism or dissatisfaction as well. I can only see faces with uncrinkled brows, so I don't.
I'm notoriously uncrinkled that way, or rather, I'm always a bit crinkled, but you can't see it on Zoom. That's the thing. Speaking of Zoom, I mean, one of the things that struck me really was when you quoted people from the 1930s who were concerned about people in the BBC studios performing into these very futuristic kind of spaceship looking like machines that they had, the BBC back in the day. And of course, I thought of all our students these days who complain that they are performing for Zoom when they do, rather than for live audiences. And in a way, isn't it funny how these things come back to bite us sometimes? These ideas that the machines are among us, and in a way, of course, they're helping us, but are they really? I think the discussion is still ongoing, isn't it, in a way?
There's lots of interesting ideas. I mean, another one of the Bolter Gruson ideas is the idea of remediation, and there's been obviously a lot of really great scholarship in the area of remediations of opera and opera on screen and televised, stage versions and that kind of thing. So that's a really exciting area which intersects with all of these. You have sort of Stephen Connor's, I've got it just here, the cultural history of ventriloquism, and Glenn Watkins and Daniel Albright, talking about sort of intersections between all the arts and modernism, and around sort of the obsession with Pierrot figures, the obsession with masks and machines, and how these things all link together. And so I think, anyway, that was more of a comment. But the other thing about that awesome picture of the panel, right? You can get that as a Zoom background. Actually, I don't know if people have seen the BBC has released a whole lot of famous movie sets as well from way back. You can be in the TARDIS from the very first. There's a range of TARDISes that you can have as your Zoom background. I'm talking about remediation.
Yeah, I must get me one of those, definitely. Because I said I'm sitting in front of a badly hidden washing machine behind me, so anything will be good. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, when you said, if anybody wants to utter any doubts, I was actually going to speak for the things you said. I've just recently written a little book chapter which is around British music of the same time, so it's 20s, 30s, and a lot of the kind of experimental but still lingering tonal music that we have at this time. And of course, the obvious elephant in the room at the time for the people is Showback, and atonal music, and then of course also 12-tone music. And I've found that writers who were also composers at the time, for example, like John Folds or Lambert, and these people sometimes tend to speak of Schoenberg as an engineer, which again confirms really nicely your field, really, and that there is this wide concern about this. So I was wondering if, especially as we're talking about BBC, of course, in the 30s, where Edward Clarke's working in the music department and he's just programming lots and lots of Schoenberg and Bach. Do these debates of mechanization, do they speak to atonal and 12-tone music specifically as well? Or is there no direct link there, perhaps?
I think that's interesting you raised that, because you're referencing also Jenny Doctor's work there on the BBC. If I was to think about people like Constance Lambert and Cecil Gray and their criticism of Schoenberg and their desire to set up a alternative canon where Sibelius and Delius and a range of other figures are sort of seen as the great figures of the time as an alternative. I've written previously about how that relates to an idea about the intellectual in Britain at the time, and how people, musicians, artists from the continent were seen as kind of thinkers and overly cerebral, and they theorized before they did things. And in Britain, people just kind of, they were used to sort of hands-on acting and doing things and building things, and that's why Sibelius seemed very, very, amenable, and Delius and all these people for whom who about whose music it was said you couldn't analyze with using conventional means because it was so fluid and that kind of thing. So there's a whole debate about anti-intellectualism and the position of the intellectual, and that's kind of where I positioned that debate about Schoenberg. But yeah, I mean, because they center the mechanization stuff on Hindemith. That's an interesting point about this kind of linking the national temperament idea of the valorization of the anti-intellectual to the mechanization stuff. Thank you for that. I'll think about that further. I think is it Gavin who had the hand raised?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. That was a really really thought-provoking talk, and I'm particularly thinking about the film extracts that you've shown, and actually the relationship between music to silent film, and perhaps with reference to Adorno and Eisler's view that the music somehow humanized the ghostly image, but also perhaps going against that is that a lot of the music was performed on mechanical devices like Wurlitzer organs, and whether there's anything to sort of discover there, whether there's this sort of circular relationship between what we're seeing and what we're hearing and how that sound is itself produced.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. And also the idea of, which Abate has written about as well, but also Julie Brown, the idea of that even in silent film, music being performed as a way of synchronizing movement. So performed on set as a way of synchronizing movement in silent film. So in a way, sort of synchronizing and mechanizing the actors in, to the march of a centralized sort of drum that is unheard in the final product, and that tension between, yes. That is interesting, and I think that could play into it, so I appreciate you raising it. I had film in the title and went with animation because I found those clips just really fascinating. But I think there is an argument to be made about when media is in certain media that deals with sound separated from its sources in its early stage, and its tendency to be towards hypermediacy in those early stages. And so an author whose name escapes me at the moment has written about how this happened with music video as well. And so the early days of MTV were very, very much in the sort of hypermedia phase where they were, referencing the weirdness of having the music come first and the image come afterwards. And there were a whole lot of sort of tropes around air and waves and things that were used in early music videos, that there isn't this kind of hypermediacy, this awareness of the media, this foregrounding of the media in more recent examples, and it makes it a bit more conventional. So by the time you get to sort of colour animation and Looney Tunes, you still have characters doing things that they wouldn't be able to do physically in real life. They're still, dealing with the medium, but they're not, it's not thematized in the same way as it was in the 1930s in those early days. They were really kind of, using the content to question the form or to do something with the form. And I just find that really, I think there's something to be done there that's not just about media, that it is about this sort of relationship between content and form and some sort of tension going on in earlier phases. It's not just about sort of looking at, I'm interested in looking at, everywhere in literature there's stuff about stones that speak, or architecture that has some kind of personality, or and these things are very much linked to sort of pre-Darwinian kind of ideas about. Anyway, it's a whole field to do with stones, which I wanted to link through to sort of after the Second World War. But I'm essentially, the short answer being that I wanted to think about how this grappling with form and content is in earlier periods is like a kind of hypermediacy in the area of new media. So that's kind of what I'm trying to experiment with. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Gavin and Sarah. Yeah, we've got two comments in the chat that I'd like to kind of highlight. One is Anna. Hello, Anna. Saying that Busoni visited the RNCM, as it was then. Anna, do you want to speak to us about that? And then afterwards got a comment from Devon as well. Anna, are you there?
She may not have access to video.
She may not have. Hello. No, perhaps not. But of course, it's good to know that Busoni, as you said, was someone who managed to get round quite a bit. I just came across Busoni recently because I was looking into early microtone composers, and of course Busoni and Alois Haber were working quite closely together, and that's another of these very, very interesting things that Busoni was involved with, was the building of his ideas of third tones and building of instruments that could actually play this microtonal music is another, I guess, in a way, item that plays on this whole kind of keyboard of mechanization. Good, so I'm going to move on to Devon. Devon has written in the chat that he says his internet is a bit fussy, but he thanks you a lot for the talk. So I'm going to, Devon, if it's okay, I'm going to take the liberty and just read out your question for you in case you get stuck or can't unmute yourself or something. So Devon says so I'm going to quote, my PhD research revolves around using Deleuze's concept of the body without organs as a compositional device. there seemed to be some interesting overlap between topics. So I was wondering if you'd run into the kinds of discussions around his conceptualization of this need for subordination that crosses these personal, political, and historical pathways. Devon's question.
Yes, Devon, that's a really good question. The Busoni project started as an idea about sort of opera without bodies, and so it was very much about bodies and allegorization of the body. And I did try, but what I wanted to do is to again locate it in something really concrete. And the reason why I got to Brecht was because Busoni was a teacher of Weil, and there's a direct link there. There's, again, situating people in rooms, and also because Walter Benjamin wrote about Brecht's epic theatre, and then Judith Butler developed, in like 2 years ago, wrote a new correction to her, or rather a clarification of her idea about performativity, and she uses Benjamin's reading of Brecht to discuss that in relation to decontextualized bodies that are quotable, like phrases that become quotable. And there's a Deleuzian aspect there, and there could be something with the bodies, but I wanted to keep it with Benjamin because Butler uses Benjamin. It was trying to sort of trace a operatic prehistory of performativity, essentially, which is an even more difficult bow to draw. But thank you for bringing that up. I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe we can email. Maybe you could email me and we could have an exchange over. I'd like to hear about your research too. So.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Devon, if you're here, do you want to? Can you, or do you want to speak to us?
Hi, I think maybe the audio is just good. So fingers crossed. Sarah, thank you so much for answering that question. That was a really great answer as well, seeing as how you're definitely drawing from this kind of historical lineage. Yeah, it'd be really fantastic to chat back and forth a little bit more about ongoing research and stuff. Yeah, I'll send you an email. Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions? Jeff.
Thank you, Sarah. That was an incredibly rich presentation. I'm going to, when I have time, look at the recording because there's so much there that I think I would want to revisit and think about more deeply. Before I ask my question, I want to pick up on the one that Anna wasn't able to pose. Yes, Busoni did come to Manchester several times. He was very much a keen player in the circle around Adolf Brodsky. And we have some of his letters here, in fact. Just a little bit of trivia. If you look at those letters and the letters which are in Berlin at the moment, one of the things that emerges is that Brodsky tried his absolute hardest to appoint Busoni as professor of piano at the Royal Manchester College of Music. And that's a great might have been, but that in a way is a sideline because my question is completely different.
I'll just jump in there. I think he got burned by the Boston experience, depending on what year you're talking about. He was very much
1904-ish, possibly.
It was before his Boston experience, so maybe he would have been amenable to it then.
Yeah. No. What I was going to pick up on is this the BBC, because my delving into the BBC at this period is probably not as detailed as yours has been. But one of the things that does emerge is the kind of social background of the people who are running the BBC at that time, with very fixed cultural ideas. And I was just wondering how that actually feeds into this idea of the BBC as an agent of cultural control at this time.
Yeah, I think you would know more about on the question of social background. I think the idea of raising public tastes as a genuine kind of educative social mobility project. All the music appreciation stuff. There was a bit that I cut out about what the middle brow actually refers to in this context, and of course, there's a lot of construction of musical appreciation as being like telling people, these kind of pat answers. If they want to know what, Schoenberg is doing here, then we'll give you a pat answer on the BBC, and then you can impress your friends at a party. So it's kind of, rather than it being kind of access point to real art, it's being, you can just purchase it. But I think from the BBC's point of view, or at least some of the people that I know who were involved, there was, even though it was from a kind of conservative and paternalistic frame, there was also this aspect of, of access, of cultural democratization, which was, a large part of the programming, I would have thought. Does that square with what you...
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard because the critics of the middle brow are just... the critics who constructed the middle brow, in a negative and pejorative sense, are seen as elitist, cultural gatekeepers, and not moving with the times, and against the kind of rising middle classes and managerial kind of ideas about professionalization, accreditation. Everyone's going for exams, and they're not really doing individual things. They're just trying to be standardized like every other model, and that whole culture. And they're seen as kind of grumpy old elitists, sitting in rooms just grumping about things. But the thing is that it was attached to part of the politics of this particular clique of critics, was attached to anti-democratic, anti-liberal politics, which shaded into a kind of proto-fascism in some areas along the Hilaire-Belloc kind of line. And Dorothy Swainson had some sort of link with Hilaire-Belloc, which I just found out 5 minutes before sort of pressing the Zoom button. So I'm going to check that out, because people like Cecil Gray definitely had a link to that culture. But I don't think they weren't, people like Lambert weren't against cultural democratization per se. They believed in, the lowbrow. They believed in people having access to some kind of musical experience. But it was just the manner of the sort of top-down paternalistic approach that they objected against, because it looked very much like, a kind of being fed by a nanny state.
And if you look at some of the names in the sort of the 30s at the BBC, people like Bolt and Healy Hutchinson, we think of these as sort of old venerable figures, and we forget that at the time they were more the Young Turks, determined to stamp their own image on the BBC.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd like to read your stuff on the BBC, and to hear more about what you're doing in that space afterwards too.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Jeff. Do we have Barbara? Yeah, another one.
I just want to pick up on your discussion with Sarah when you were talking about Schoenberg and the sort of anti-intellectualism, and the way in which Schoenberg is described as an engineer, that in those terms. In France, he was, that sort of discussion around Schoenberg was actually quite anti-Semitic, and I just wondered whether that had similar resonances in Britain. But there was a lot about seeing him as a chemist or an engineer of something that is fake, and doing it in a different way than they would have done it to Raval, who's also seen as being artificial, but not in a way that is cosmopolitan and therefore also anti-Semitic. So I just wondered whether there were those sorts of layers of significance in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's been links made in some excellent scholarship in on Ezra Pound and Vorticism, who was linked with this with the Cecil Gray Heseltine kind of clique in certain ways, and the idea of imitation. So there's fear of imitation. If you think back to the sort of the three different readings that I gave at the beginning, the last one being this fear of merely being a copy of the copy, this fear of imitation, and the way some scholarship has read that is being from a kind of eugenicist standpoint. So the idea of sort of finding the strong, authentic, original bloodline, and not perpetuating these artificial, superficial, imitative kind of procedures. And so there was lots of focus on the economy of expressive language, on pared down, expressive forms. I'm not sure. I dare say that it was explicit in the anti-Semitic direction, and I think I've read. I'm just thinking back to the letters of Busoni that Jeff was talking about, but there's been a whole lot of published letters of Busoni that at one point I read through from cover to cover, and I'm sure there was something there. But the eugenicist link with the fear of imitation, both on an expressive level but also on a societal level, this idea of reproducing minds, standardizing minds, mass producing minds, is definitely there's definitely a link there.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. Having looked at this whole criticism of Schoenberg as the engineer, it usually comes with as part and parcel of them saying, oh, he's a mathematician, he's not a musician, so the authenticity is lost according to this criticism. But at the same time, of course, it often kind of capsizes into ideas that Schoenberg is hysterical, that Schoenberg's music is hysterical at the same time. So it's the spectrum of mathematician and hysteria that are somehow in the criticism often kind of are mixed up when people in the 30s talk about Schoenberg's music. And this very, very great defensive-ness somehow that you find in the criticism of this time often. And I find that so interesting when you were talking about early on, I think about the BBC case study. I found it so amazing, this hen and egg situation that we get in interwar Britain at this time, where the criticism and the experiments that are actually going on all the time are constantly basically throwing polemics at each other in different ways, be it in music or be it in writing, that you can often not tell what is a response to what. Is that an impression that you have as well, or am I dreaming that up?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that the type of stuff that I'm reading is probably, if I was going, I had a whole section there again on the kind of idea of lateness. So that, if you think of things as an echo of, so drawing from the idea of performing to a machine, there being no sort of original event, no original audience, and being an echo without an original source, and all that means in terms of the technology, but also the conceptual aspect of that. The idea of the echo being linked to, lateness that I wrote about in the book, namely that it relied on a certain generation of people who were born in the around the 1880s. These particular critics are all born around that period, so that when the war came, that it was at the kind of just the crest of their careers, and it was all going to happen for them, and it didn't. And so there's this sense of unfulfilled promise, thwarted opportunity that doesn't really apply to the next generation. And so there may be it may be that it's a generational fatigue issue. So they're not in their senior period, but their moment was taken away, and it was a particular generation that did that. There was something else I was going to say. It was sort of of existing as an echo, but never fully experiencing the golden, his imagined golden past. There was something else, but it's gone.
It'll probably come back tomorrow morning or something.
It is tomorrow morning right now.
It is tomorrow morning. Oh, sorry. Yeah, indeed. No, thanks a lot. It's a lot of food for thought that we're getting. Do I see any more questions?
Annika, I've just got another one. Sarah, me again. Actually, seeing the Betty Boop animation with the plant in it, which communicates with her and eats whatever she was eating, it's made me think about relationship of technology to nature, and in particular, a recent book I've read about the relationship of animals with music and technology. And I've just looked it up actually, and this the author tells us that early vivisection equipment was used in the development of audio technology. So it seems to make that link with what
book
we're
is that?
discussing. This is Animal Musicalities by Rachel Mundy.
Oh, Rachel Mundy. Okay. Yes, I've read some of her work. Animal. Okay.
It's
yeah. I mean, I think that the part of the project that I'm going to start next year is done with two bioarts people who work, who essentially use living tissue in their art, and they have these kind of science arts. They have a lab essentially, and so they're very interested in not only in ideas about, so the project's about automated labor, and it's not only about human machine interactions, but also sort of the automation of life, the idea that in contemporary agricultural settings you have the breeding of certain cells and parts of animals to do certain functions agriculturally on a mass scale. And so this sort of breaking down of life and animals into small parts that can serve these kind of mechanized functions is definitely part of a discourse that I suspect, I mean, as you've just said, has historical roots. And there's obviously, the stuff that Jonathan Stern has done in terms of relating ideas about expert listening in the telegraphic kind of context to earlier ideas around medical devices like the stethoscope and other things, and the use of body parts in initial phonograph technology. The idea of the sort of corpse's ear that you stick on is a way of everyone's seen that great picture. But yes, so decontextualize bodies and body parts and their use, and the breaking down of life into small parts is not only a human thing. Definitely, it's linked with animals, and definitely linked with ideas about life. I was wondering whether somebody would comment on the flower, because in a way it sort of segued between two things that I wanted to show you. But I was there going, I think there's something with that flower that's between the kind of the gramophone head and the sawn off lips, and that's a great reading. I really like that reading that you've offered there. Thank you. I'm going to check that Mundy book out too.
Yeah, it's a really good book.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks both. Any more questions? I have a feeling there'll be lots more kind of occurring to us over quite a bit of time, probably. Just because, as Jeff said, I think quite a few of us will probably want to go back and actually look at it all again, because it was so very rich and
please don't. Just wait for the much more carefully worked out publications to come out, and then deal with that rather than the midnight kind of drawl. Okay.
No, thanks a lot. Good. If there are no more questions from us for the moment, then allow me to, for all of us, thank you so much again, Sarah, for kind of coming to us from far away and at an uncivilized time and presenting a fantastic paper that's given us lots and lots of things to think about. Not just those of us who also work on early 20th century British music, like myself, but there are many kind of cross-fertilization. There's much cross-fertilization potential here, I think, and that's really lovely to see. Thank you very, very much. Barbara, do we have a virtual bar? Okay, do you want to take over on that?
Well, Sarah, we'd love to take you to the RNCM bar. It's a very good bar with lots of different gins and things, but that's not quite possible. And it probably is it the